In today's video, we're going to create this beautiful 3D card interaction with holographic effect. It's going to use multiple layers in Figma that shows at different time and drag distance. Now these two layers will create the gloss holographic effect, and we have the logo and the circles that creates the 3D parallax effect. It's important to understand the file formats. So for example, if it has a lot of transparency and is in vector, which means it's scalable, then you should be using SVG or PDF. If it's a background that is in bitmap, meaning that it's not scalable, you're going to see a lot of pixelation, or it has a lot of effects and colors, typically you want to use the JPEG format. However, if that image uses alpha transparency, you have no choice but to use the PNG format. Another thing that is important to do is once you have those files exported, you should optimize the file size. For example, using image opt-in, you can save 50% of the file size and more. Keeping your files really small is really important, and it's the key factor to selecting between SVG or PDF, as well as between PNG, JPEG, and other formats. So let's create a new file in Xcode. This is a SwiftUI view named Card Reflection View. Now make sure that you have those images imported. So that includes the background, the two gloss SVGs, and the logos. In the view, let's start by replacing the text by an image. So setting the name right away to background 1. Then I'm going to set this to resizable with an aspect ratio, content mode fill. Then I'm going to set a frame using a height of 600. Then I'm going to add a corner radius of 50. So without the corner radius, the image is going over the bounds of the frame, and the corner radius is going to serve as a way to clip. Now, if I want to make the size smaller, I can use the frame, or I can also use scale effect to 0.9. Scale gives a lot of flexibility, especially for animation or for adapting to different screen sizes, but make sure that whatever content that you have in the card after the scale, that it's always readable and always sharp. Next, I'm going to add a background, but first we need to embed inside a Z-stack. Let's use color for the background. The name is background, then ignore safe area. So my background here has light and dark mode. If I want to force a color, I can always use preferred color scheme to dark. I can choose to use this inside the body, or I can use it in the preview, which will only be seen in the preview. Next, we're going to add the logos on top of the image. So I'm going to use an overlay, parentheses, then start with image logo 1. This also will be resizable with aspect ratio to content mode fit. Then set a width of 180. If I want to have more elements inside my overlay, I need a container first. So let's put that inside a Z-stack. Then let me copy and paste the first image because it's going to have similar properties. This time it's logo 2 with 400, then logo 3 with 392, and height 600. Now notice that the logo 3 doesn't have a blending mode, which we had in Figma. So we need to apply the blending mode inside Xcode. Let me set it to overlay. Now the logo 3 should definitely use a content mode to fill instead, so that it's going to use all available space. Finally, all three logos should be using the same scale and should be clipped as well. So I'm going to move the overlay before corner radius. And that's it. We have the basic card layout. In the next section, we're going to add the glossy reflections and apply the outlines with blending mode. It's going to be really cool, so I'll see you in the next section. In this section, we're going to take care of the rest of the gloss effects as well as the outlines and the drop shadows with blending mode. Going back to Xcode, let's go to the overlay, and at the very end, we're going to add another one. Overlay, then image, gloss 1, making this resizable, aspect ratio dot fill. Then we're going to make sure that we add a masking that use alpha opacity. So it's only going to show certain zones of that image. As a result, when we do the drag, it's going to be able to move as well. So let's do mask, then linear gradient using colors. Now I'm going to use clear, then white with full opacity. Then the start point, top leading, and end point, bottom trailing. As you can see, this mask is only taking care of the alpha. So from here, which is completely transparent, to here, which shows the whole thing. Now let me just maximize this a little bit. And for clear and white, what I can do is to copy this, add another comma, and I'm going to paste 2 times. So now we have 6. Just make sure that you have a comma between each of those colors. Then I'm going to add a 7th one to restart to clear, because it's generally a good idea to go back to the same color as the first one. And of course, you can customize to have as many as you want, but this gives us more of those zones where it's completely transparent. Finally, I want to make sure to restrict the size of my gloss. Otherwise, it's going to take the full width of the screen. So if you have a really big screen like the iPad, it might look very different. So what I'm going to do here is to isolate the linear gradient. Then on that gradient, I'm going to set a width of 392. Finally, we can take care of the blending mode. Since this is pretty much using a dark color and it doesn't blend as much, so we can use blend mode, set it to soft light, for example, and that looks much better. Now I want to have 3 of these gloss layers. So instead of repeating a lot of this code, I'm going to create a code section for it. So var gloss 1 of type SumView, curly braces. Then I'm going to move the entire image to that view. And I'm going to reference it to gloss 1. Since it doesn't have a lot of code afterwards, I can just remove all of that spacing. Also, I'm going to customize the blend mode, so I'm going to move only this modifier right after the reference. Now at this point, I can add more of these gloss overlays and mix and match between multiple blending mode, such as luminosity or overlay. But what I want to do here is to use another image. So I'm going to have to copy the gloss 1 and use gloss 2 and set the image to gloss 2. Now gloss 2 is going to be referenced here instead of gloss 1. And also, let me just see what it looks like before the blend mode. It has a little bit of colors. So putting it back, you can see that it adds a little bit of those colors plus overlay. Now the final result that I'm looking for is another gloss 2, but the one in the middle is going to be luminosity. Great. Again, there are so many possibilities to how you can compose the holographic effect here. So feel free to customize these blending modes as well as the gradient positions and sizes. It's going to be even more interesting when we're going to start working on the gesture and it's going to be interactive. Next, I'm going to add the outlines as well as reflection. So I'm going to use another overlay, and here I'm going to use linear gradient as well, using the colors and the start point and end point. So let's start with clear, then white dot opacity 0.5. Start point top leading and bottom point, bottom trailing. So we have a little bit of reflection, and I don't want to use a full white color, so that's why I'm using opacity. And also I want to reset it to dot clear by adding a third color. So this adds the reflection to the entire card and not just the holographic element. Then we're going to add the border. So overlay, let's use a rounded rectangle with the same corner radius as the card itself, which is 50. Then isolate this rounded rectangle. I'm going to add a new modifier, stroke border. Then I won't customize the style and just the color, which I'm going to use linear gradient, again taking care of the 3 values. Then similarly, I'm going to start with clear, then white, opacity 0.75, and I'm going to copy and paste to have more, so until we have about 5, and finishing with clear. So again, clear, then white, clear, white, clear. Start point, top leading, bottom point, bottom trailing. Now we have a super interesting outline that has a gradient that jumps between clear and white, and then clear and then white, going from top left to bottom right. And this gives a very modern look that you see on a lot of new designs nowadays. But on top of that, we can create really interesting animation with gesture. Next, I'm going to add a new layer on top of everything with a blend mode to give more interesting colors. So let's add another overlay, linear gradient, colors again. So I'm going to show you how to use color literal, which is a little bit different from the past. You're going to name color first and parentheses, then pound color literal, camel case, parentheses. This is going to create some sort of an image, and you need to double click on it, and now you're able to select from the color picker. For example, you can use one of the purple color, and also if you click on other, you can have even more customizations, including the opacity and the ability to customize the hex color value. So if you want to follow exactly the color that I have, it's 5D11 F7 and press enter, and there you go. So color literals are quite useful for prototyping, and you need to remember that they're fixed, which means that they're not going to adapt to light mode and dark mode, but it's super flexible and you can copy and paste to have more colors. Of course, customizing the values and the opacity. So now I have 2 purple colors at 50% opacity, and I'm going to change the start point again to top leading, then bottom trailing. Now this is going to be far more interesting with blend mode, so make sure that you isolate the linear gradient and apply a modifier, blend mode. Here I'm going to use overlay. Finally, we're going to add a drop shadow after the corner radius, otherwise it's going to crop. So let's do background this time. Sure, I could have used drop shadow, but in this case I want to use a drop shadow with a blend mode, which means that it's simply going to be an element that replicates the card. So rounded rectangle, corner radius of 50, and I'm going to start with a fill that is black. I also want to move this by using offset Y of 50. Now I have something that looks like a drop shadow, and I can use blur of 50 as well. Then opacity 0.5. Then finally use my blend mode of overlay. So by doing this way, we have a lot more flexibility as to how we want to customize the drop shadow, use the blend mode, and it's going to look really good on any background color. So with this, we're ready to animate the whole thing by using gesture, and that's exactly what we're going to learn in the next section. So I'll see you then. In this section, we're finally ready to apply the gestures, but it's not just any gesture. Normally, you can apply a translation that works either vertically or horizontally. Now, what is different about the technique here is that we can seamlessly apply to both directions at the same time using this trick. Now we're going to start with the basics. So if you want to apply a gesture, you have to store the value that you receive when you swipe on the screen. So we're going to store that inside a CG size at state var translation of type CG size is equal to 0 by default. Now CG size is very similar to CG point, except instead of the X and Y value, we have the width and height. After this, we're going to create the drag. So var drag of type some gesture, curly braces, and we're going to start with a drag gesture, parentheses. Then we'll use the unchange event, press enter, get the value in. So the value that we receive is going to be the translation. So we'll store that inside a state using value.translation. Then when we're done with the swiping, we want to reset the positions. So add unended, again press enter, value in, then reset translation to 0. So if you've done gestures before, this is nothing new, but I wanted to start with this so that we can follow what's going on. Now we're going to apply the gesture on the image itself, which is the card. So at the very end, right after scale, we're going to apply gesture, then drag. So far, this means that when I swipe on the card, it's going to store those values. We just need to use them on something such as offset, but in this case, we're going to use rotation 3D effect. For the angle, we can use degrees. And here, thanks to the translation value, we can decide to influence the perspective. So I can set translation using either width or height. In this case, width is going to be horizontal. And then I want to apply that to X, Y, and Z axes. So let's try 1 for X, 0 for Y, and 0 for Z. As a result, when I swipe left and right, it's influencing the X axis. Now I can change this to both X and Y, and you're going to see that it's going to change both. And the Z axis has a little bit of rotation going on top of that. So if you want to apply that to just the Y, which is more fitting, it looks a little bit like this. It's pretty cool. It creates that flip card effect. Also, when you release, you want to be able to transition back to make it more seamless. So as a result, I'm going to add with animation and put the state change inside the curly braces. So now it's pretty seamless. But what I want to do is to be able to swipe both angles at the same time. Now the trick that we're going to use here is to set a fixed value for the degree. In this case, we can use 10, and then use the translation state to influence the axes. So in this case, set translation to width. Now when I swipe left and right, you can see that it's changing the angle of the card. But it's not very nice because the transition is not smooth. Now what if I set the translation dot height for the x-axis? So now the magic happens and it is smooth when you apply to both axes at the same time. It's just that it's not going towards the right perspective that I want. So I need to set minus translation height, and therefore it does exactly what I want it to do. And also I can customize the sharpness of the perspective. So for example, setting it to 20, the perspective is going to be even sharper. Let me put it back to 10. Now, one thing that you're noticing is that as soon as I release, it doesn't give me that smooth transition back. And so the width animation that we use that worked on degrees doesn't seem to be working for the axes. Now, the solution is to create a Boolean that activates when we start swiping and using the card, and then go back to a degree of 0 when we release. Therefore, the degrees will change and it will transition back smoothly. So let's do that. We're going to go back to the state, set state var is dragging is equal to false by default. And then we need to set it to true when the dragging happens. So is dragging is equal to true. And then on release, when we're done, we're going to set is dragging is equal to false. And finally, going back to the degrees, we need to set a condition that says is dragging, question mark, set it to 10, otherwise go back to 0. Now when I have this and I release, you can see that the degrees gets back to 0, and then we have a smooth transition. So that's how you create a beautiful 3D drag gesture that works on both the X and the Y axes. Now in the next section, we're going to apply the holographic effect. So from the gesture, it's going to change the reflections as well as the parallax on these front elements. So I'll see you in the next section. Now that we have the drag gesture set up, we can take it to the next level. Even though this is already pretty cool, we can add a 3D parallax effect as well as the holographic effect on the reflections and gloss layers. Let's start with the 3D parallax. So going to the 3 logos, I'm going to use a simple offset modifier, and it's going to set the X position by using the translation.width. And then we'll do the same for the Y position by using translation.height. Now you can see that it's a little bit too fast. So we're going to make it slower by dividing the value by, let's say, 8. For the height, since we have more distance to cover, we should divide it by 15. Now you can see that it looks a lot better and more natural. And we're going to do the same for the other 2 layers. So let me just copy and paste the offset modifier on both. And it's very important to have different numbers because we want a parallax effect, meaning that layers need to move at different speed to create depth. So for the logo 2, I'm going to set to 10 and 20. And for logo 3, 15 and 30. Now we have something that looks really good, from the front element that goes faster to the more background elements that move slower. And that's just how simple it is to apply parallax effect using gesture. Now we're going to apply the holographic effect. And to do that, we're going to modify the gloss elements. So let me scroll down at the very bottom. And here, as we apply the alpha masking, we're using gradient. Therefore, we can change the positioning of the gradient to create the opacity as we drag. So in practice, let's go to endpoint, and we're going to set unit point, because in this case, instead of doing top leading, it's going to use numbers. So unit point allows us to set the X and Y values. So we can use either translation width or height. In this case, I'm going to use translation height as well as translation height for Y value as well. Now you can use width for the X position, but in this case, I found to have better result using the height value. And also you're going to notice that it's barely visible, meaning that it might be a little bit too fast. So as a result, we're going to need to divide the number by 100, and the same for the Y position. And boom, we have this beautiful holographic effect, but we can definitely push it even further. But this is a really good start. Now, one thing that I realized as I was creating this is that when you swipe down, so the number is positive, it's going to move the alpha gradient. But when you move up, it's not doing anything. So what is happening is that this is going to become a negative value. And so when we have a negative value, it doesn't work well. So what we can do is to make sure that this value is always positive. And to do that, we need to set ABS for absolute and then wrap the translation value. And then we need to do the same for the Y value. So translation.height, wrap that inside parentheses and set ABS. And voila, we have the effect regardless if we decide to move up or down. So using this unit point formula, we can essentially apply the same for the gloss 2. So let me just replace this. Make sure that it's before the end of the parentheses. So now we have a really cool holographic effect on both layers. So the first layer is just dark and the second layer has a little bit more color, and that creates a really nice effect. But also we're noticing that when we reset the position, it's not showing any more the gloss layers. So what we can do here is at the very end, we're going to start with 1. So we're going to do +1, and this ensures that we're showing it by default at position 0. So let me do the same for height as well, and for the gloss 2. So +1 and then +1. Next, we're going to apply the same technique on the border reflection as well as the whole card reflection. So let's scroll up a little bit to find the overlay for the stroke as well as the normal overlay that used the linear gradient. Now I'm going to use exactly the same formula from before. So unit point with translation height, and boom, we have the whole reflection effect as well. And you can customize the values if it's too fast or too slow, and also customize the starting position. So for example, +1 and +1. And finally, we can copy the same values for the stroke border as well. Then we also have reflections on the border as well, which is awesome. You can customize this, for example, 0.5 instead of 1. So this is going to move the default reflection on the border. Now feel free to play with the values and the speed to see what works best for your design. This is super customizable and really fun to create. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'll see you in the next one.